This pawn advance immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and king's bishop, facilitating rapid development and setting the stage for many classic opening systems. This move prepares to open lines for the queen and bishop while also setting up a solid pawn structure, leading to the French defense, which emphasizes strategic maneuvering and counterplay on the queenside. This move establishes central pawn control and prepares to open lines for development, aiming for an advantage in space. This move is a fundamental challenge to White's center, initiating the renowned French defense and aiming to create an unbalanced pawn structure for dynamic play. This move, nc3, is a flexible and common response that develops a piece and supports the d4 pawn, often leading into the queen's Indian defense or various lines of the French defense depending on Black's subsequent moves. This move, the classical variation of the French defense, aims to immediately challenge White's central pawn structure and prevent a comfortable development of White's pieces. This move of pushing the e-pawn forward to e5 is a common strategy in the French defense, aiming to gain space in the center and potentially restrict Black's light-squared bishop. This move prepares to castle kingside and supports the pawn on d5, while also developing a piece to a natural square in the French defense. This move prepares to gain space on the queenside and potentially dislodge Black's bishop, which currently pins White's knight to the king. This move exchanges a well-placed bishop for a knight, a typical strategic decision in this variation of the French defense to disrupt White's pawn structure and potentially gain an advantage in the ensuing endgame. This move creates a doubled pawn on the c-file but opens the b-file for potential rook activity and reinforces control over the d4 square. This move challenges White's central pawn structure and aims to open lines for Black's pieces, creating dynamic counterplay. This move aims to prevent Black from establishing a strong pawn center with cxd4 and nc6, instead solidifying White's queenside pawn structure while creating a long-term weakness on the queenside itself. This move develops a knight to its natural square, challenging White's control of the d4 square and preparing to castle, while also potentially eyeing the weak c3 pawn. This move develops the knight, prepares kingside castling, and supports the e5 pawn, aligning with standard principles of central control and piece activity in this Caro-Kann variation. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, preparing to castle queenside and potentially support a queenside pawn advance with b6 and c5. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the kingside and supporting the central pawn push, while also preparing for potential kingside castling. This move develops the queen to a more active square, connecting the rooks and preparing to challenge White's central pawn structure. Castling kingside completes the development of the king to a safer position, allowing the rooks to connect and prepare for potential central pawn breaks. Black pushes the c-pawn to c4, reinforcing their queenside pawn chain and restricting White's bishop, but potentially creating a long-term weakness on the d4 square. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to challenge Black's advanced pawn on c4 and potentially support an eventual kingside attack. This pawn sacrifice on f6 aims to disrupt White's pawn chain and open lines for Black's pieces, seeking active counterplay in the center and kingside. This move repositions the rook to an active file and supports the central pawn push with f6, preparing to contest the open c-file. This move repositions the knight from an active but somewhat exposed square to a centralizing outpost, preparing to challenge White's space advantage by attacking the e5 pawn. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakened c3 pawn. This pawn capture challenges white's central space and opens the f-file, aiming to activate black's pieces and create counterplay. This pawn capture opens the d-file, creating immediate tension and forcing black to decide how to resolve the central pawn structure. This move directly challenges white's central pawn, aiming to disrupt the pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces, a key objective in this variation of the French defense. This exchange resolves the central tension, opening the d-file and challenging black's pawn structure, creating an imbalance in pawn play for the endgame. This recapture on e5 re-establishes central pawn tension and opens the d-file for black's queen, while also preparing to challenge white's knight on f3. This move develops the queen to an active central square, eyeing the weak pawn on c4 and preparing to support a potential kingside attack. This knight redeployment aims to reposition to a more active square, potentially challenging white's advanced pawn on f6 or supporting a kingside pawn push while avoiding the current capture on the queenside. This move, bh5, forces black to address the immediate threat of the bishop's pressure on the vulnerable f7 square, potentially leading to a material imbalance or a compromised pawn structure. The king's active positioning here aims to escape the pin on the f-file and potentially support a future pawn advance on the kingside, while white's pieces are centrally coordinated. This move signals a clear intention to seize central space and prepare for an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure created by black's earlier moves. This move aims to connect the rooks and prepare for action along the e-file, potentially challenging white's control. This aggressive pawn thrust aims to dismantle black's defensive pawn chain and exploit the open f-file for white's pieces. This pawn capture opens lines and aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure, though it sacrifices immediate pawn material and requires careful defense of the king. This move forces the king into a precarious central position, opening lines for white's pieces and creating immediate threats against black's king. The king's retreat to f6, while seemingly passive, consolidates the king's position and prepares to defend the pawn on e5, anticipating white's active piece play. The bishop retreat to f3 aims to reposition the piece defensively, guarding the weak e5 pawn and preparing for potential counterplay along the kingside or by supporting a future pawn push. This move aims to redeploy the knight to a more active square, challenging white's bishop and potentially opening lines for counterplay. This queen repositioning prepares to exploit the weak dark squares around black's king and potentially attack the g6 knight, aiming to gain material or positional advantage. The king's desperate flight to g6 aims to escape the immediate pressure of the queen and bishop, seeking more breathing room and potentially connecting with its remaining pieces, though it exposes the king further. This move, 23, rxe5, opens the e-file and creates a powerful central tension, forcing black to decide how to resolve the immediate threat to their queen and pawn structure. This move is a tactical blunder, as accepting the queen sacrifice allows white to deliver a devastating discovered check with the rook, leading to a rapid loss of material and a compromised king position. This move exploits the exposed position of black's king and the pinned knight on g6, creating a powerful centralizing attack with excellent piece coordination. This move repositions the rook to the open d-file, aiming to pressure white's queen and potentially create counterplay against the doubled c-pawns. This move captures a pawn on b7, But the advanced passed pawn on the d-file presents a more immediate and dangerous threat that should have been addressed. This move sacrifices the queen to force a checkmate, demonstrating a common tactical theme of using a queen sacrifice to eliminate a defender and create a mating net, with white's king having reached a safer square behind the f-pawn. This move addresses the immediate threat to the king and prepares for further development or defensive maneuvers. This move seizes the open d-file, increasing pressure on white's king and offering a defense against the potential discovered attack on the queen. This move forces the black king to move again, allowing white to continue developing initiative while simultaneously disrupting black's coordination and potentially winning material. This move is a critical defensive maneuver, aiming to consolidate the queen's position after white's aggressive checks and prevent further material loss by blocking the check and preparing to recapture the rook. This move aims to solidify white's queen's attack on the black king by bringing another piece into the assault on the weakened kingside, while also potentially controlling key central squares. This move is a desperate attempt to exploit the misplaced white king by forcing checks and creating drawing chances through perpetual check, but the material deficit makes it unlikely to succeed against accurate defense. The king steps onto the board to escape further checks, repositioning to a safer square and preparing to contest the open files. This surprising sacrifice exploits the white king's exposed position on g1, forcing a critical decision that will likely lead to the recovery of material or a devastating checkmating attack for black. This capture is a forced sequence, as black's king is now directly exposed and white aims to exploit the open lines and advanced king to force checkmate or gain overwhelming material advantage. This is a forcing check that aims to expose the black king and create mating threats or win material. White's king must flee the relentless mating net created by black's queen and rook, seeking safety on the only available square before further material is lost. Black has just captured the white rook with their own rook, an exchange that seems to simplify the position but unfortunately leaves black's king vulnerable to immediate checks and potentially an early checkmate. This move, by capturing the pawn on c6, removes a critical defender of black's king and opens up the queenside, aiming to exploit the exposed black king. Black recaptures with the queen, centralizing it and preparing to contest the open c-file and attack white's weakened queenside pawn. Structure. The rook sacrifice on g2 is a desperate attempt to disrupt black's advantage, aiming to simplify into a king in danger endgame or force an exchange that might offer drawing chances. But black's king is too well protected. The king's escape square on f7 was blocked, forcing the king to seek safety on f6 to avoid immediate checkmate and prepare for potential defense. This move recaptures the pawn on a7, aiming to simplify the position and reduce black's attacking potential by exchanging material while creating a passed pawn. This move aims to create counterplay and potential space for the black king by pushing the g-pawn, hoping to open lines or create a safe haven for the monarch. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control key central diagonals and potentially support a kingside attack or pawn push. Black's recapture of the pawn on c2 is a sensible move, aiming to regain material and consolidate their position in a complex endgame where both sides have a passed pawn and exposed kings. This aggressive pawn push aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside, aiming to restrict black's king and potentially create mating threats while simultaneously forcing a piece exchange. This move aims to centralize the queen and potentially create threats against white's king and pawn. Structure. while also preparing to contest the open d-file should white's rook decide to retreat. This move activates the bishop to exploit the king's exposed position and aims to deliver checkmate, or force significant material loss. Black's king is forced into a precarious position with this move, as white's bishop now has a direct line of attack, potentially leading to a forced checkmate sequence or significant material loss if not defended meticulously. This move advances the passed pawn, aiming to escort it towards promotion while forcing the black king to remain defensively occupied. Black's last move aims to contest the open a-file and prepare to exchange white's strong bishop on b6. But it weakens the queenside pawns and doesn't fully address the dangerous passed pawn on a6. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control the long diagonal and potentially support a pawn push on the queenside, while also deterring black's queen from further incursions. This move strategically repositions the queen to a more active square, anticipating white's likely pawn push and aiming to contest the vital d-file. The rook repositions to the b-file, aiming to support a potential pawn advance or challenge the open file, while also defending against any counterplay the opponent might generate on that side. This move creates a passed pawn that must be dealt with, potentially forcing white's pieces to retreat or become incoordinated. The bishop retreats to b6 to defend the knight on a6 and prepare to potentially support a central pawn push, while also keeping an eye on the weakened dark squares around black's king.